Proceedings approved. Are there any public comments for items that are not on the agenda? Yeah, we're not a big audience. We're rolling right along. Okay. Well, we're on to consider draft addendum, Amendment 3 for public comment. I turn it over to Melissa. Who's going to turn it over to Micah?
Thank you. You ready, Jeff? All right. So go to the first slide there. This is just a reminder of the annual maturity cycle of herring and the corresponding rise and fall in GSI. And the point of this is to try to close the fishery when the GSI is at its just prior to its peak, just before spawning occurs, which is at our maturity stage 6 there. So most of the samples that we collect from monitoring this fishery come from stages 4 and 5, towards the end of their late maturation. And the way the system currently works is that once we get 2 consecutive samples above a threshold, the fishery closes for 4 weeks. Now, if we don't have enough samples to inform this, a default closure date applies. And when this system was developed in the late 90s, we didn't have the depth of information that we have now to evaluate the parameters of this closure system, the trigger levels, the duration, or the default closure dates. And so the task was assigned to me to look over the past 20 years of new GSI samples that we've collected to try to evaluate how effective and appropriate this system is. So this is a look at those data combined from Massachusetts and Maine GSI sampling. So part of this relies on the assumption that GSI tracks this development and ultimately lead up to spawning, and we definitely see that in our GSI sampling data, that as you go through the maturation stages, that you get this increase in GSI. And that this is convenient here that the increase in GSI leading up to spawning is linear, or approximately linear, in these last few stages between stage 4 and 5. And we definitely see that here, both in the Gulf of Maine and in other parts of the world. And it's been long recognized that there's a relationship between the size of the herring that you sample and the GSI that you observe. And with larger herring typically achieving larger GSIs. And because of this, there's been 2 size bins for these triggers of what GSI constitutes the point at which you want to close the fishery. But this relies on the assumption that these different size classes achieve a different maximum GSI for spawning. And so when I reviewed these data, that does not appear to be the case, that all herring, regardless of size, achieve a similar maximum GSI. And this has been seen elsewhere in other herring stocks and has been explained because of a size-dependent arrival on the spawning ground, with larger herring spawning first and smaller herring spawning later. And you can see those red lines there are the existing threshold levels that we use to close this fishery. And you can see for the smaller fish, less than 28 centimeters, that threshold is quite a bit lower than the GSI that they attain. And so trying to confirm this, I went to see if this average size of herring over the course of the season is decreasing, and in fact it is in a significant way, so that you have the larger fish first and sequentially smaller fish as you progress through the season. So to try to explore all the other factors that might be affecting herring GSI and that we might need to incorporate or account for in our closure system, I explored some generalized linear models, and I apologize for the technical output here, but if you just pay attention to the red notes, I think the point will get across. I did do another model where we looked at the gear type, whether purse seines or bottom trawls had a different, but it really did not affect anything, so I pooled those together. for now, I'm omitting midwater trawls because we don't really have midwater trawl GSI samples at the same time as any of the other gear types. So I don't really have this simultaneous collection of data to be able to compare the effect of that factor. But what we see is this J is Julian day, the day of the year. There's this steady increase of GSI of 0.2 per day after controlling for all the other factors. But from year to year, you see that the actual day of spawning can shift by 6 GSI points, which using that rate is about 30 days. And this is the reason why we need to have this GSI monitoring system, because if you rely on just a fixed date each year, you may be off by 6 weeks, and which can be a problem with a 4-week closure. And here's the length effect, and that there's a pretty strong length effect where 1 centimeter increase in length has an increase, corresponding increase in GSI of 1.8 points, which is about 10 days of timing of spawning difference. So using this, we can now correct for this difference in length of herring between the samples and standardize everything to a fixed length. So I'll return to that. And finally, the area, the spawning area, where the fish are collected, the eastern Maine area appears to be strongly significantly different earlier spawning than the other 2 areas, but there is no evidence of a significant difference between the western Maine and Mass New Hampshire areas, which are better sampled anyway. So then to choose a sensible trigger level of when to close the fishery, I looked to the stage 5 distribution of GSI samples. And if you think about that first plot I showed, that stage 5 is the last phase before they reach actual spawning, the distribution of GSI values that you get during that stage are really the final accumulation of GSI up to spawning. So that something towards the right or tail end of this distribution would make sense to be something to indicate when spawning would occur. So I arbitrarily picked 3 levels from this distribution: the 90th percentile, 80th, and 70th percentile. And these colors will remain consistent as I go through the rest of the slides. And you can think of further to the right, the blue level represents a trigger associated closer to the actual spawning date, whereas points to the left, the red, the 70th percentile, represents a closure that would be protecting more pre-spawning fish. So this may be a little small to see for some of you in the back of the room, but so I took these points and I looked at our previous 10 or 12 years of samples to see when these 3 potential triggers would have been reached. And this will give you an idea of when you would have achieved that threshold in past years, and that distribution can help you inform what an appropriate default date would be. So if you're going for something that's closer to closing right prior to spawning, over the past 12 years, that was the blue box there, October 17th. If you want to provide more protection for pre-spawning fish closing earlier, that's closer to September 25th. And you can see that interannual difference there, where some years it's quite a bit later than other years. And you can see the steady linear increase where there's pretty little deviation from those points in the line after you correct for the length discrepancy between samples. There's also been quite a bit of studies done back in the 70s on herring spawning in the Gulf of Maine, so I wanted to get a sense for what other information was out there for when herring spawning occur. And so this is what I found that was relevant to our spawning areas. In the Mass New Hampshire area, they did submersible missions. They did scuba diving out on Jeffrey's Ledge, grab samples, and they were identifying when they found demersal herring beds in the bottom. And so there's a range there between September 20th and October 30th. So that's right in the ballpark of what our GSI sampling has shown, maybe somewhat earlier. We don't have the depth of samples in the eastern Maine area, and I wouldn't rely on our GSI samples to inform what appropriate default date would be for that area. And I think it's probably more reasonable to rely on the the studies that were done in the 80s there, where they looked for when they found the demersal egg beds there on lobster traps in eastern Maine. So August 28th was the average first spawning in those years. Another thing is that the range and when they found these egg beds was around 40 days for all of these areas, except for this one on Jeffrey's Ledge, which was a relatively smaller sample in a smaller location. The current closure is 4 weeks. 40 days is closer to 6 weeks. It's 42 days. So it appears that the herring spawning season length is somewhat larger than the current system. So if we were to use this evaluation of our GSI data to steer the closure system in a new direction, these are the recommendations that would come out of it. Since there's no significant difference in spawning times between Western Maine and Mass New Hampshire, it seems appropriate to combine those two. This can be beneficial in a few ways. One, that instead of dividing our samples now between smaller bins and we deal with sampling size issues and whether we have enough to be able to inform the closure, we now have a larger pot of samples to go from. We should have a target of 25 fish per sample. Right now we don't have something that's listed in the plan of what to do, and I think putting that on paper makes sense. It's a good practice. Using the GLM model, which included length, if we standardize everything to a single length that takes account for the differences that have been between samples from areas, there's been a perceived difference between samples collected by Maine DMR and Mass DMF, and I think that is largely explained by the difference in lengths that those two fisheries encounter. And so if we standardize to a larger size herring, here I'm standardizing to 30 centimeters, the larger herring spawn first, you're starting the closure when the herring first start to spawn. That's the idea there. There's options in selecting a new trigger value, or those points in the distribution of whether you wanted something closer to when spawning is actually occurring or whether you wanted a point closer to earlier in the season to protect more pre-spawning fish. And the recommendation is that once you have enough samples to detect a sufficient increase in GSI, that you use that rate to forecast a closure date when you cross that threshold. And have some amount of days that you would have to be this number of days away to predict when that closure date would occur. And using the previous sampling data, we could alter the default dates to this schedule here, which is dependent on which GSI trigger you would go with. And a closure period of 6 weeks is likely more aligned with the biology of herring than the current 4-week closure. So if we were to pursue something like this, the benefits would include that we would now have some advance notices when the spawning closure is likely to occur. Now that we are predicting a rate based on samples collected from the beginning of the season, we follow that through and update it as we collect more samples. So we have some indication of whether this is to be an earlier year or a later year. This also reduces the pressure to obtain samples just at the right time. The current system is you have to get 2 consecutive samples within a week above that threshold, so that's just prior to spawning, and sometimes it can be difficult to get these samples, and we may not get them in the same week, or we may not have sufficient sample sizes. This system relies on all the information contained in all the samples you collect throughout the season. So since you're including length and the other variables that I included there, we're more aligning it with the reproductive ecology of herring, so hopefully it's more effective for its stated goal of protecting spawning herring. And lastly, it reconciles this perceived discrepancy between the 2 states that are collecting these data. There's been discussions before whether there's different spawning times from the areas where the Maine fishery occurs, the Massachusetts fishery occurs, but when you account for the difference in lengths between those samples, you don't have a difference between them. So if we have time, I just have some example of how this this proposed system would unfold using previous year's data. And so I'm used in 3 different cases, one with good, not so good, and worse data. So in 2011, we had consistent regular sampling. The first 5 samples were not sufficient to be able to detect an increase in GSI. And it wasn't until that 6th sample that we were able to detect a slope to that increase in GSI to forecast a date that it would pass that threshold. And I just used arbitrarily 5 days as the buffer to when you're going to pick that date. So on this, using the threshold, the lower threshold pre-spawning closure, you would on September 1st have forecasted the closure on September 5th. If you go with the 80th percentile on that distribution for the other trigger levels, on September 11th, after our 8th sample, we would have, after September 5th, we would have predicted a September 11th closure. And if you go with one that is protecting fish right up to the point of the spawning, you wouldn't have announced a closure until the 22nd for one starting on the 27th. So here in another year, we've had difficulty acquiring samples in stretches of weeks, and so we would have first forecasted a closure date of the 16th. We've done that on September 7th. And then you can see an addition of another sample causes that update to shift now by several weeks. And this is because we don't have consistent sampling. So this underlines the need to have regular sampling if appropriate. And then finally, in a year where we have poor sampling, where we weren't able to collect many samples, we wouldn't be able to detect that increase in GSI, and the default date would apply in this case with any of the trigger values. So I apologize for the amount of technical details that were in there, but I just wanted to relay the full potential changes that would happen to the closure system and where they came from, the justifications behind them. So happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Micah. I suspect there might be. Questions for Micah? Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in the beginning of your presentation you said that there was not any bias as to method of harvest, difference between bottom trawl and purse seine. Did I hear that correctly, or is that not correct?
There was no detectable difference in GSI between bottom trawl and purse seine. That's correct.
David?
Yeah, thanks, Micah. In your presentation, you said, I believe, that there's a 10-day difference between the onset of spawning for a 28-centimeter fish versus a 27-centimeter fish. Can you elaborate on that? What would account for something so different in terms of timing with only 1 centimeter?
Right. Well, a 1 centimeter bin is pretty big for herring, where most of the population is between 24 and 28 centimeters. But that's what's showing the strong significance of the relationship between length and GSI, which we take to mean as being the timing of spawning. And so that's the slope accounting for all other factors of length on GSI. So increase in 1 centimeter length is essentially saying about a 10-day later spawn time. I use 27 to 28 as an example.
Other questions from the section? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Micah. Interesting analysis. I think the projection idea makes a lot of sense if you're not going to increase sampling. But my question is, did you analyze at all what the benefits would be to the spawning stock biomass going from 4 to 6 weeks? I mean, clearly there would be a cost to the fishery, but can you project a biological benefit to the already large spawning stock biomass? I mean, relative in terms of cost benefit. Did you look at that at all as a PDT?
No, we didn't draw that connection here. We were just basically taking it that the assumption is that the goal of the system is to try to adequately protect spawning fish, and we were evaluating the performance and the adequacy of the current system in protecting spawning fish. So we didn't go by extension determine the impact on the total stock, the benefit of increasing protection or aligning it better with the life history.
David?
Yeah, Micah, can you put this in a nutshell? You just asked the question that we've asked you, the degree to which spawning herring are being protected with the current approach that we use. So, to what degree?
what do I see the current system is lacking compared to the proposal?
Right. Yet to what degree are we not protecting spawning herring as a consequence of the analysis you did, which was in concert with someone else, or did you do this yourself? I can't recall.
No, this was with Matt Sierra. I mean, the Maine and Mass have collected a large number of samples. There's like 8,000 GSI observations over the past 12 years, and we've pooled our raw data to do this analysis, which is something new for us. We've always compared the results of the sampling and used those to inform this current system. But so in the end, the analysis of the combined data set, I think, identifies that we've likely been closing several weeks before spawning in the average year. That the current threshold of 15 for younger fish and 20 for larger fish often is closing quite a bit earlier than spawning actually is occurring if we think that they're all attaining a maximum GSI of somewhere around 28 to 30. So that's quite a, and with the 4-week closure, we may be closing, long before they're actually achieving spawning, and then the overlap between the spawning period and the true spawning activity may be limited.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, all right. So if we've been closing several weeks before actual spawning takes place, your analysis indicates that if we use the approach that has been assembled and put into the documents, we potentially will improve. We will dramatically increase our accuracy regarding the timing of when they actually do spawn. So we wouldn't be closing several weeks before spawning. We will be close to when they are actually spawning. And to add to that, that would mean that we would not run the risk of having to extend the spawning closure beyond the expected opening, right, because they will have concluded spawning. So, okay, all right. This does what you said. The analysis that you've done does strongly suggest that this would be an approach we should seriously consider. Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions from the section? Questions from the audience? Mary Beth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a couple of questions. One was perhaps a follow-up to Dr. Pierce's comment, and I'm wondering how many times we've had to extend the spawning closure 2 weeks after it's reopened. There's a lot of, particularly in the Massachusetts, New Hampshire area, there's a lot of fishing activity that takes place after that opening, and I don't recall it happening very often, if at all, but I'm sure I'm missing something.
It's happened at least once in my tenure. I've only been covering herring for the past 5 years or so, but it has happened at least once during that time. Sorry, I don't have like the full library of history there, but we also have the rule that's currently in place to cause a reclosure and extension is based on if we see greater than 25% of fish in spawning condition in a sample afterwards. The sampling intensity and effort that occurs after the closure is far less than what occurs in the lead up to try to inform the initiation of that closure. So the GSI sampling is the primary amount of work, and then there's more opportunistic and scant samples coming in afterwards. For one, it's the fishery doesn't last nearly as long on the tail end, and so I don't think we have as good information on that end to be able to inform that, unfortunately.
And then just a question on Table 3. I notice in the studies that you cite, 3 out of the 4 are references to eggs. And the program has never, in my history with it, ever considered eggs. Mm-hmm. Certainly egg mats on the bottom are not disturbed by the fishery at all. And it certainly does seem to have quite a long season length. So was there some reason that you incorporated egg beds and larvae into your calculations?
They weren't incorporated into the calculations. It was just a check to see what other information was out there that could inform the timing of spawning in the Gulf of Maine. And those were the other studies that were done that were relevant. So when egg beds that were found at those specific locations. Those were the dates, on average, of the years that they visited them.
And just one last question. What do you think is the biggest impact increase from the 4 to 6 weeks? First, I thought it might be the inclusion of small fish with large fish, and I heard you reference larger fish coming in earlier and the smaller later. And I'm not sure if we'd looked at it that way in the past. Is that what is the main driver of the extension to 6 weeks?
Yeah, so 6 weeks appears to be the range of time when there's evidence of spawning activity from the literature. And elsewhere in the world, 6 weeks is toward the low end of, it's typically more 6 to 8 weeks elsewhere in the world. But locally, 6 weeks is the signal that comes through. And by standardizing the sampling to a large fish, which we believe spawn first, the idea is to start the closure when the first ones are spawning, the large fish, and then follow that through to when the smaller ones spawn at the tail end. And that's the initiation is at the larger fish, and then you follow it through to all size classes.
Are there any further questions for Micah? Seeing none, thank you very much. We're going to move on to the review of the options from Melissa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So now we'll go over the options that are in Draft Amendment 3. So the 3 issues, as a brief review, are spawning area efficacy, fixed gear set-aside provision, and the empty fish hold provision. So this is the timeline for development of Draft Amendment 3. Today, the section will consider approval of this amendment for public comment. If approved, public comment period will occur in May or June. And then the board will review comments and consider the draft amendment for final approval in August. So these are the chapters in Draft Amendment 3. At the last section meeting, I gave an overview of each chapter and a review of the issues, statement of problems, analysis of biological and socioeconomic impacts. So today I would just focus on the management options. So the management options for the 3 issues can be found in Chapter 4 of the amendment. For Issue 1, there are 4 sub-issues with proposed management options based on the technical report findings that Micah just gave. So these are the closure monitoring system, spawning area boundaries, default closure dates, and the closure period. So Issue 1.1, the closure monitoring system. Option A is status quo, is to maintain the current spawning closure protocol for GSI-based triggers and the fixed default closure dates. So closures in a given area will begin based on the spawning condition of Atlantic herring as determined from commercial catch samples. Commercial catch sampling shall begin at least August 1 for eastern and western Maine areas, and by at least September 1 for Massachusetts, New Hampshire's area. If sufficient samples are not available, the closures will begin on the default dates. Continuing on with Option A, closures in a given area will begin 7 days after determination that female herring in the gonadal stages of 3 to 5 from that specific area have reached the following spawning conditions. So again, these were broken into 2 size classes. Female herring greater than 28 centimeters in length will have reached GSI index of 20%, and female herring greater than 24 centimeters and less than 28 centimeters in length have reached a GSI of 15%. And here is the formula that is used to calculate the GSI. So for option B, which is the GSI-based spawning closure forecast system that was just presented, the closure date for the spawning areas will be projected based on a minimum of 3 samples collected from the fishery, each containing at least 25 female herring in the gonadal stages of 3 to 5, with a target of 50 samples. Acknowledging that the larger herrings spawn first, female GSI values would be standardized to that of a 30 centimeter fish. So this is the new formula that will be used in this forecast system. So continuing with option B, once a significant positive linear relationship is detected between GSI 30 and the day of the year, the slope of this line will be used to forecast a closure date. The forecasted closure date will be the day when GSI 30 is projected to exceed the trigger value, and there will be further sub-options in the next slide. As additional samples are collected, the forecast will be updated, and once the forecasted date is within 5 days, the spawning closure will be set or announced. If no significant increase in GSI 30 is detected prior to the default closure date, the default closure dates would apply. So for the trigger values, there are 3 sub-options. Spawning occurs at the completion of maturity stage 5. Therefore, a point at the high end of the distribution of observed GSI values for stage 5 fish should be used as a trigger. I've indicated with an arrow where the trigger values are. A higher value closes the fishery just prior to spawning, whereas the lower value provides additional protection for more pre-spawning fish. So issue 1.2, spawning area boundaries. Option A is status quo, is to maintain the current spawning area boundaries for the 3 areas. Option B would be to combine Western Maine and Massachusetts, New Hampshire area. So there would be effectively 2 spawning areas. Issue 1.3, default closure dates. So for option A, status quo is to maintain the current default dates as they are set, and then options B1, B2, and B3 would be based on the trigger values. As you can see, as the trigger values increase, the default dates start later in the year. Issue 1.4, spawning closure period. So option A is status quo, is to maintain the default closure of 4 weeks. Catch sampling of the fishery will resume at the end of the initial 4-week period, and if catch sampling indicates significant numbers of spawning herring are still being harvested, then the closure will resume for an additional 2 weeks. So a significant number of herring is defined as 25% or more by number in the catch sample that have yet to spawn. So option B would be to extend the closure period for Massachusetts, New Hampshire area, or if the Western Maine area is combined with Mass, New Hampshire, then the area will be area closure will last for 6 weeks. So moving on to the second issue, which is the fixed gear set aside. Option A is status quo. So currently the fixed gear set aside is available to fixed gear fishermen in area 1A until November 1. If the set aside has not been utilized by the fisheries at that time, it is then made available to the remainder of the herring fishing fleet until the directed fishery in area 1A closes. So the fixed gear fishermen can continue fishing landings that will count towards the area 1A subquota. So option B would be to remove this set aside rollover provision. The fixed gear set aside will be available to the fishery in west of Cutler through December 31st. When 92% of the Area 1A TAC has been reached, then all the directed herring fishery in Area 1A will close. Unused portion of the fixed gear set aside will not be rolled from 1 year to the next. Issue 3, empty fish hold provision. Option A, status quo. There is no requirement for the empty fish hold prior to a fishing trip departure. Option B, which would establish the empty fish hold provision. This option would require that fish holds in Category A and B Atlantic herring vessels are empty of fish prior to leaving the dock on any trip and declared into the Atlantic herring fishery. A waiver may be issued for law enforcement by an appropriate law enforcement officer. The intent is for waivers to be issued for refrigeration failure and non-marketable fish that can be reported to the vessel. So only vessels departing on a fishing trip are required to have the holds empty of fish. So as such, the waivers would not be required for vessels that are just transporting fish from dock to dock. So are there any questions for the management options in Draft Amendment 3?
Clarifying questions only. Dave Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just kind of curious, did the enforcement committee weigh in on the feasibility of inspecting holes and how much of a burden that will place on enforcement staff?
There'll be an enforcement committee report shortly.
Okay, so they'll deal with that?
Jeff?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not really a question, but I just wanted to point out, after looking at the document the other day, Melissa, that the herring EFH maps were updated by a vote by the New England Council last week. So at some point, if this does go to public hearing, the maps might want to reflect the new designations. They're not actually approved yet, but intended to be changed.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was one of my questions, was where do we sit between here and the council's decision? The second thing was, I assume the empty the fish hole thing is for all fishing areas, not just 1A. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
David?
Yeah, Melissa, or Micah for that matter, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the options for the spawning closure period in the context of whether or not we select the new approach for monitoring the GSI. I note on page 39 of the document, under the spawning closure period, in the paragraph that's under issue 1.4, there's an important statement, and it's the last sentence in that paragraph that reads, "Therefore it appears the current 4-week closure period is inadequate, and increasing to a 6-week closure would provide a better match for the available information on the duration of Gulf of Maine herring spawn." And then we have status quo, and then we have extend the closure period to 6 weeks. My question is, if we go with a new approach for monitoring the GSI, and right now we're closing 2 weeks earlier than we should, would status quo, that is a 4-week season, be the logical outcome? You follow me? Why would we need 6 weeks if we change the timing of the spawning closure so we're on target? It would seem, so I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Because if we go with a new approach, it would seem to me that option A would be the logical status quo to adopt. So that's my question. How do we reconcile those two?
Micah?
Sure. We don't have GSI samples to really tell us the duration of the spawning. We only have information really to inform when spawning starts. So we don't have any of our own data to say how long spawning is likely to occur, unfortunately. So we've relied on other sources of information from the literature, from primarily when egg beds have been found and where it's been documented elsewhere in the world, and that's where the 6 weeks come from. So I think that we've been starting 2 weeks early under the previous system on average, and that we also haven't provided the length of coverage as before. It's also, we've relied on default dates very heavily in previous years, primarily because of the difficulty to obtain samples that meet the parameters of the closure system as they're currently laid out. And
Okay,
Melissa had the point she wanted to answer your question.
Melissa?
And also, that's why we have these under separate issues, so that if, for instance, the new method doesn't get approved, then there's still the option to extend the default closure by 6 weeks, to 6 weeks.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, then just to clarify, if we don't go with the new sampling approach, we would likely close 2 weeks early. So if we decide to go with option B under issue 1.4, extend the closure period to 6 weeks, okay. it potentially would be longer than 6 weeks? I'm not stating that correctly. All right, I have to think more about that. Sorry.
And actually, I've got one clarifying question. If you say there's no samples, I mean, we're essentially closing 2 weeks early. I mean, the existing protocol is we leave the fishery open until we do have sufficient samples. So, I mean, my sense would be that we were starting the spawning closures when the ripe fish were ready for closing. And at least strictly from the state of Maine's perspective, we are sampling as soon as the season's opens back up. Further clarifying questions? Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm following up on Dr. Pierce here. If we've been closing 2 weeks early, then why don't we just close 2 weeks later and get the full 4 weeks? Why do we need to change everything we're doing? Wouldn't that essentially do the same thing?
Micah?
I'm saying that there's lots of evidence that the timing of spawning changes is pretty variable from 1 year to the next, and the current system doesn't do a good job of detecting that and aligning the interannual difference in spawning with the closure system. The new system is designed to be able to pick up on that, to identify if it's going to be an early year or a late year and close when the spawning is actually occurring, and rely less heavily on a default date because of the inability to collect samples that meet the current system.
Are there any further questions? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions to Micah. I know in the past the AP has recommended, and you'll hear it again, recommended again in January, that the technical committee look at the potential to go back to the tolerance system, which would improve the sampling ability as it used to at least in terms of targeting when spawning is actually occurring. Did the TC evaluate that at all this year, or was it just left on the shelf? I've got one other question after that. Thank you.
Micah?
We talked about it, the TC talked about it, but it's actually tasked by the section, so we didn't look at it in depth.
That's a good question, or answer rather. My other one is, for this new sampling, with this tri-state, is there a commitment between the 3 states to increase sampling to support the new tri-state spawning approach that's discussed in there?
Micah?
Yeah, in our discussions, it seems to be that that's the case, and by combining those two areas, we're already increasing the number of samples available, and not by splitting them between size bins, we're increasing the number of samples. So altogether, now we have a much larger pool. Before, we were dividing between areas and dividing between size classes, and we'd end up with 2 herring in one area, in one bin, and what do you do with that information? We couldn't use it. Default date applies. Here, we're using it all together to try to inform an appropriate closure.
Any clarifying questions from the audience? Mary Beth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of back to the same theme again here, because I think I just don't understand it. And when people were asking questions relative to the length of the closure, you brought up spawning, the egg beds again. So how do the egg beds have an impact on the proposed length of the closure?
Micah?
That is the only information we have available to identify what the length of spawning season is around in the Gulf of Maine, Western Maine, and Eastern and Mass New Hampshire area, is the duration of when herring egg beds have been seen in specific years, and those were the average time period that they were observed in the years of those studies. Unfortunately, we don't have a good way to document the end of a spawning season from our fishery-dependent sampling, because GSI, it increases up to spawning, and then herring are determinate spawners. They lose all of their eggs in one shot, and then so you just see this plummet of GSI. So I think if we were able to collect GSI samples throughout the spawning closure and beyond, we might be able to have a better handle on that in the future and could improve that closure length information.
So did you consider the fact that the majority of the fish that are caught in the Gulf of Maine are by gear types that don't interact with the egg beds at all, and that we hadn't considered egg beds in the past?
The closure system, I don't think, is designed to protect egg beds specifically. It's trying to protect the spawning activity, and we're just using the egg bed information to identify the closure length.
I'm still quite confused. I mean, you know, I recall when the original spawning measures went into place in 1983, and I've seen a lot of change over the years, but we've never considered egg beds or impact egg beds. Most of those impacts are by other gear types and not the herring fishery gears that are used. And so the length of spawning, when you include the egg beds, just is very different. And I could say inappropriate, but I'm not supposed to be commenting.
Okay, seeing no more further questions, we're going to move on to the AP report. But before we do, I'd like to welcome Senator Langley back to the table. Good to see you again, Brian. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the herring section. Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Kalin, the AP chair. I work with Lund's Fisheries in Cape May, New Jersey, and I am a Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council member. We had a conference call, I think it was a call, if I remember, yes, on January 6th on this amendment. Obviously, it was before Micah's analysis. I think we had a quorum. I was on, Patrick Paquette, Phil Rule, Mary Beth Tooley, Stephen Weiner, Madeline Hall Arbor, Melissa, and Jenny Beechrist. We received, we obviously focused on this amendment, and the PDT was analyzing the various options. The report that you have goes through the layout of the options, as Melissa just provided us with additional detail. When we get into the first issue, spawning area closure in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, AP members continued to unanimously support the status quo option, the 4-week option, with continued sampling by the commercial fishery and closure when triggered by significant levels of ripe fish. Arbitrary closure is not necessary. Closures may force midwater trawlers to displace towards the northeast and fish on smaller fish. There is no biological need for additional spawning protection because the SSB is way above target and threshold according to the 2012 stock assessment. The AP would like to see more analysis to justify 6-week spawning closure. And there was a observation that commercial sampling is not sufficient. And the AP discussed again, just as I mentioned a few minutes ago, reinstating a tolerance for spawning fish. One benefit for a tolerance is the opportunity to collect samples of herring for gonadosomatic index analysis used to inform the spawning area closures. A tolerance is not expected to increase fishing pressure during spawning events because there's no market for spawned and feeding fish. Spawn herring is known to decay more rapidly and is not favored by bait dealers and other end users. The AP requested the PDT to explore this program, but as Melissa had said, so far we haven't had the support from the section. Staff informed the AP that the PDT has completed analysis of herring spawning efficiency, which we just had in detail. On the fixed gear rollover, a description again of the status quo and the AP perspective, where the AP did not believe adjusting the current fixed gear rollover provision is necessary at this time. The fixed gear set aside is a very small amount, therefore not too many people will join this fishery. The proposed measure may create an allocation issue. In the past decade, there's been no fixed gear landings from November to December, therefore no justification for using resources to implement adjustments to the federal and interstate plans at this time. I note that there is going to be a Down East fisherman who has some perspective in this fishery added to the AP, I believe, and that'll be positive because we haven't had anybody active on the AP from the Down East area for some time. On the empty fish hold provision, obviously it came from the Council's Framework 4. There's a discussion about how the waivers could be used, and also support by the AP for the requirement, maintaining the recommendation for no limit to the number of waivers at this time to be consistent with the federal plan. To address concerns raised by state and federal law enforcement officers, the AP commented that refrigeration failure events are rare. This measure may help tighten up and discourage wasteful fishing practices by a few individuals. The AP discussed reasons in which a vessel may not be able to offload herring after a trip. Some vessels, particularly smaller vessels, may not have pumps on board, but the ports where additional vessels offload typically do. The AP suggested adding an additional option that specifies ability to pump fish off the vessel. That language is in the AP report, and if this moves ahead, I think it's language that bears the section's attention. And I think, Mr. Chairman, other than the AP supporting Mr. Stanley's becoming a member of the AP, the fixed gear fisherman from Maine I just spoke of, that concludes my report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And for everyone's clarification, Maine is recommending for your consideration a stop seeing fisherman from Mount Desert Island. It's one of our last pieces of business today. So questions for Jeff on the AP? Adam.
Thank you very much. So in your report, the AP suggests additional study on the 6-week period, and the draft addendum says that earlier studies showed the typical duration in the spawning area is 40 days. What additional study is the AP suggesting, and are they directly contradicting that earlier scientific information that the typical spawning period lasts 40 days?
Well, the AP, of course, not being biologists, we didn't have that number in front of us, but I think the question that I asked of Mike earlier, I think, captures what the AP was getting at on page 2, asking that there be more analysis to justify the additional 2-week closure in terms of benefits in to the spawning stock of Atlantic herring. That was the question. That was the analysis that the AP was looking for. Some estimate of what the benefit to the Atlantic herring resource would be with the extension to a 6-week closure. And while I'm at it, on page 23 of Amendment 3, it basically says, according to the 2012 stock assessment, the spawning stock biomass of Atlantic herring in 2011 was over 500,000 metric tons, which is 230% above the SSB MSY of 157,000 metric tons. That gets to the nature of the AP's question, I think, Adam.
Other questions for the AP? Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know there's certain times of the year, Jeff, that the fish get, I think we use the word mealy sometimes, they get soft right around the spawn, either before or after. And if we change the date that we harvest on these fish around that spawn, would it affect the usefulness of the fish harvested as far as how they would keep or how they would store?
Well, I think with a feedy fish issue, I think most of the people around the fishery believe that the waiting to open the fishery till June takes care of a lot of that feed problem. Spawned fish are not desirable. They're more desirable for lobster bait than they are for canning, which doesn't happen very much. But I would think if you put off the spawning closures for 2 weeks, like Dr. Pierce was talking about, looking at the fact that they seem to be closing earlier, I don't see how that would negatively impact the quality of the fish. You'd be moving the closure into the period of time when the fish were spawning predominantly and minimizing that effect, I guess. That's my educated or partially educated answer, Steve. I think you guys will put just about anything in the bait bag if there's enough demand. But
other questions from the section? Any questions from the audience? Mary Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could, to speak to Adam's question as a member of the AP, And the AP met, I forget what the date was, Jeff just said, but we met with the same document that you all met with in January. There was no new information. So the information that the AP was seeking that you have today was not available. In fact, the AP met on one day and the PDT met the next day. And even at our meeting, getting the document out to the membership was really quite late and only upon request. So, the PDT had what you had in January, which you all thought was not adequate, which is why you sent it back to the PDT. And, the AP didn't have anything new to respond to.
Any further questions? Okay, seeing none, we're moving on to enforcement. Mike? Are you making the enforcement committee report? Yes, please.
The report speaks actually to your question about reasonableness for the empty holds, and in our discussions that we've had, I believe that it is reasonable. Once again, it seems that these events would be, very few or not frequent. So I think it would be reasonable. Understanding that now that they're not every time, and that certainly would be what we would look to enforce.
Any? Eastman. Any questions for Mike? Seeing none, we've heard all the reports. What's the pleasure of the section? Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I wanted to get clarified in the document, it's on page 18, and the 1.3.5.1 bait. There is another reason why the herring, the demand for herring as bait has gone up, and it isn't just because of increased fishing effort on lobster. It has to do with the decrease in other baits. I've seen this like in my harbor where we never used to use herring at all. I mean, it never even showed up. We used groundfish, and of course the groundfish going down had caused the lobstermen to use other types of bait, and herring came into play. So I think that you don't have to add this in, or you could add it in that paragraph, that also the decrease in other available lobster baits has also caused the increase in the use of herring. And I also noticed it was interesting that herring eat cod eggs, and and we're in a cod situation. Mr. Chairman, is it time for me to make a motion to approve this document for public hearing? Is that what you're looking for?
Unless there's any further discussion. Seeing none, Bill?
I will make the motion to approve this amendment, draft amendment for public hearing.
Seconded by Dave Borden. Discussion from the section. David, then Dave.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I assume that if we pass this, we're not going to pass it with any preferred alternatives. It will just go out as is. I have my own preferred alternatives that I've selected primarily because of the discussion that's occurred around the table right now and the presentation given by Mike. I'm not going to make any motion for specific preferred alternatives because we'll go well beyond our 2:15 deadline for adjourning this particular meeting. So I do support the motion to approve, and eventually, well, let's see. All right, so if we vote to approve this, we go without any preferred alternatives, and that I guess is that your intent, Mr. Chairman? Okay.
That's correct.
I'm satisfied with that.
Dave?
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chair. This is something I asked Melissa about this morning, just figure 1 in in the amendment, the y-axis label, the SSB. Did you talk about that already? This is just something that should be fixed before it goes out for public hearing.
Melissa?
Yes, I will show the corrected table in the F&P review. Thank you.
Other comments from the section? Jeff, you got a question?
Yeah, would there be an opportunity for the AP to have at least a conference call during this public hearing process, now that we have that analysis from Micah, which we didn't have before? That'd be helpful. Okay, thanks.
And before I go to the audience, I do have a question about the timeline and the necessity of having this at an August vote. I mean, you've tentatively scheduled public hearings in May, June, at the time when the industry is ramping up to go fishing. It may be problematic getting industry members to come to the public hearings at the time period. Is there a reason why we would want to have this action voted on at summer versus the fall meeting? And that would be a question probably to Tony.
That can be to the pleasure of the board. It could be to staff's advantage since we are currently hiring someone to replace Melissa since she's moved on to California. So if the board would like us to delay hearings until the fall, then we could bring this to the annual meeting in November.
Bob?
The only other thought is the annual meeting in November is in Florida, which is pretty far outside the range of hearings. So doesn't mean we need to accelerate accelerate this to August, but it's just something to think about. Maybe even a hearing section meeting outside of this in conjunction with the council or something. You know, maybe we just need to be a little more creative so we can be closer to where the folks that fish for herring are.
My sense, it doesn't make a difference whether it's Alexandria or Florida. Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What about directing that the hearings take place in the evening? Would that make a difference?
Purse seiners fish in the evening. David?
Yeah, Bob made one of my points about the meeting being in Florida. However, my primary reason for wanting to address this as soon as possible, that is late spring, summer, if at all possible, is I really don't want to go into the fall this year closing 2 weeks early. If that's what we've tended to do, I would not want to do it again, especially since I can reflect over the last 10 years or so and the numbers of calls I've gotten from fishermen, not necessarily sea herring fishermen, but others saying the close is wrong. Well, yeah, but it's been wrong. So I would support having the hearings as soon as possible with the hope that we could make changes for this upcoming fall.
What's the sense of the section? You want to shoot for the summer or the fall meeting? Richie?
I'd agree with Dave. I think let's get it done. Clearly, they have the ability to send us written comments, which we can pay a special attention to if there is a lack of people at the public hearing.
Okay, before we move the question, are there comments from the audience? Mary Beth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things about the document. First, the alternatives are not listed in the table of contents, and so they're very difficult to find, so it would be helpful if the table of contents could lead the public to them. The analysis that's done for social impacts is 2 paragraphs plus 1 sentence, and it is all qualitative information. There's nothing quantitative there on effort, communities, bait usage, the additional 2 weeks. There's just a whole bunch of information in that section that should at least be considered, and currently there's really a couple of statements from people, and that's about it. Closing 2 weeks more could be negative. Not doing it could be positive, and what a few people said. So that to me is entirely inadequate and needs to be fixed in the document before you went out for public hearings. It does concern me, this timing that everyone's talking about, and doing it at times when people are fishing, and certainly at the summer meeting, there will be no herring fishermen here. Maybe I'll be here, I'd rather not be here, but I can assure you there'll be no herring fishermen here. You know, Florida sounds good, but again, probably no herring fishermen there either. And I wonder at what is the problem? Where's the urgency here to do this? I'm concerned about the utilization of egg beds for justification for extending closures out to 6 weeks when purse seine gear at that particular time doesn't even interact with them. So what's the benefit there? It's certainly a big negative to the fishery, but I don't see where the benefit arises. There should be some discussion of that in the document. Currently, I don't see that anywhere. And the other thing I would remind, the section is that if you look at 1983 and the stock was considered overfished with overfishing occurring, this program went into place and the stock started to rebuild. And we now have a fully rebuilt resource. It's been stable in recent years, as back as many as 15 and maybe more. Catch has been stable. So I don't really see what the problem is. We have a program. No, it's not perfect. It was never designed to be perfect. It was designed so that we could provide some protection to spawning herring and allow a fishery to occur. We seem to have gone a long, long way from that original goal and objective here. I don't see taking this out to public hearing in its current state as worthwhile.
Any other comments from the audience? Seeing none, back to the section. And try to do this the easy way. Is there an objection to moving Amendment 3 forward to public comment? Seeing not, Amendment 3 moves ahead, Joe. Bill.
The timelines, are they flexible? Like we just talked for a while about, having public hearings and when we're going to meet sooner or later. And if we take this out, is anything, is it still in flux as to we have a little leeway here?
I mean, we just agreed to try to move it ahead at the summer meeting. So, I mean, unless folks want to reconsider that timeline, that's going to be the goal at which we're moving.
Goal, Mr. Chairman, but we've done this in the past. That we've said we're not ready. We're going to hold it for a while. We've done that in the past.
You have a clarification, Bob or Richie?
Well, the delay that you discussed, Terry, the herring fishery goes until just before the annual meeting. So I guess I don't see, it's either a year delay or we go ahead as designed.
Well, I think the only selfish thing, I don't know whether any states are going to have to change their rules in order to implement a new system has been, worked. If we come up with a new spawning scenario, despite the best work of our collective staffs, if we'll have to do, supporting rulemaking, so that just might be a delayed implementation. Are there any further comments, Bob?
Just on the timeline issue, since this is an amendment, there are some provisions in the charter that we have to follow. We have to have the document on the streets for 30 days prior to the first public hearing, and then we have to have a 14-day open public comment period following the last public hearing. So, we can do it between now and August, but we're going to have to compress the schedule of the hearings so they're pretty tight. So we may, since as Tony mentioned, we are transitioning at the staff person that will be handling herring, and it'll be a compressed schedule. So we may be asking for help from the states to conduct some of the hearings without commission staff there. So I'm not sure exactly how many states will want to do hearings. We for an amendment, we're obligated to do at least 4 public hearings. So I think we shouldn't be a problem covering that, but we'll need to hear from the states on how many states will want to have hearings on this amendment pretty soon, so we can start that scheduling. The document, if we, as Mary Beth requested, correct the table of contents, that can be done fairly quickly, and we can start the 30-day clock and have the document on the street pretty soon. But we'll have to, get that wrapped up and start the clock running and start planning these hearings pretty quickly.
Okay, if there's no further discussion, we're going to move along to Melissa's update on, the 2014 FMP review and compliance. This is an action item.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is the review of the Atlantic herring FMP and state compliance for the 2014 fishing year. So first, a couple of corrections in the document. On page 4, the spawning stock biomass numbers are incorrect. So these are the corrected ones, and I will make those changes when the document is approved. The table also has, this figure also has a different axis. Just the units are off. Otherwise, it's the shape is still the same. So status of the fishery. The Atlantic herring is a commercial fishery. Less than 1% is taken by the recreational fishery. So over the time series from 1964 through 2014, as shown in this graph, annual landings from the U.S. herring fleet generally increased. In 2014, total just over 104,000 metric tons, or 189 million pounds, with the majority taken by trawls and purse seiners. So this is the 2014 breakdown by state, landings in thousands of pounds. So Maine has landed the majority at 52%. Massachusetts following with 37%, and then Rhode Island. And as a note, the New Hampshire number is confidential this year. So status of the management plan in 2014 was current through Addendum 6, which is the seasonal splitting and triggers. This is a list of the management measures. And the plan review team found that all states had management plans programs consistent with the FMP. So New York requests continued de minimis status. So the plan review team recommends granting de minimis status for this year, for 2014. In 2013, they landed 82,000 pounds. In 2014, it was 116,000 pounds, almost 117,000 pounds, and averaged 0.06% of coastwide since 1991. So they do meet the criteria. That's my presentation for the FMP review. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Melissa. Any questions for Melissa? Seeing Tom.
Did New Hampshire have only 3 people landing fish? Is that why we're confidential?
Sherry is shaking her head, yes.
Okay.
David.
Yeah, I would move to approve the 2014 FMP review and state compliance reports and New York's request for continued de minimis status.
Second by Jim Gilmore. Is there any discussion? Are there any objections? Consider the approval of the FMP review and de minimis status for New York approved. Melissa, we're on to our next agenda item, update on the New England Council's committee activities.
Sorry, 1 second as we get the motion up.
David.
Yeah, just one small thing. Insert the word reports after compliance.
Joe, I may have been jumping the gun. Do I need to read this? Okay, particularly since it's been corrected, it's a move to approve the 2014 FMP review and state compliance reports and de minimis status for New York. Motion made by Dr. Pearson, seconded by Mr. Gilmore. Okay, Melissa?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just wanted to give some updates on what the New England Fishery Management Council and NOAA Fisheries is doing for their Atlantic herring FMP. So first, an update on Amendment 8. So this document was intended to establish a long-term control rule for setting an acceptable biological catch for herring, and this would take into consideration the ecological role of herring as a forage species. So in March through April, this council staff held some scoping hearings. Framework 4, the purpose was to address disapproved elements of Amendment 5 related to dealer weighing provisions and net slippage. So this is the document that included the empty fish hole provision that in our Amendment 3. So NOAA Fisheries just received the draft, and they are reviewing it at this point. They plan to publish a proposed rule in June, followed with a comment period. And then a quick update on the stock assessment update, which is an operational update. On April 8th and 9th, there was a peer review workshop for the operational assessment update. So on May 13th, the plan development team will be reviewing the assessment and projections for specifications. They will develop acceptable biological catch recommendations for the Scientific and Statistical Committee. So this committee will then meet on May 20th to review the results, and they may recommend catch advice for the 2016 through 2018 specifications. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One update on Melissa's report is that the timeline for the council's vote on Amendment 8 is a June council meeting in Newport, Rhode Island. Questions for Melissa? Okay, seeing none, we're on to our last agenda item. Melissa.
So as Terry mentioned earlier, Maine submitted a candidate who is a member of the fixed gear fishermen. So his application is in the supplemental materials. His name is John Stanley. John Stanley, sorry. John Stanley.
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you accept me nominating John Stanley for as a herring advisor?
Is seconded by Dennis Abbott. Is there an objection to John Stanley joining our AP? Seeing none, I'll call him and give him the good news. All right, we're on to other business, and this pertains specifically to Maine, New Hampshire, and Mass. The July 1st date we had hardwired in for our potential conference call to monitor the rate of catch. On July 1st has got a conflict. Monday, the 29th, has been suggested as an alternative date. Does that work for everyone from these three states? June 29th. And per Doug Grout's request, it will be scheduled in the morning. Do folks have a preference? We'll pick a time.
I'll send a doodle.
I don't think we need to send out a doodle poll. Let's just how about 10 o'clock? Okay, we've got a lot of heads nodding. So before we close out here, as we've heard, this is Melissa's last day with us as the FMP coordinator, and I'd like to wish her a whole lot of luck in her new ventures and thank her for all her hard work.
Thank you.
Richie.
Terry, at the Days Out meeting, we talked about possibly discussing the research set aside. Is this an appropriate time for that?
This would be a good time.
So I guess we had questions as to the commission's role in the research set aside, how it's formulated, and what part do we play, and if we have any ability to affect how it's implemented.
Well, certainly we co-set the specs with the council, and it's a joint decision. So I think with Dr. Pierce and myself and and Doug on the herring, on the herring committee and the council, we can have a pretty good, and Mark, we've got a pretty good connection there, and I think that as the council begins their work there, we can probably feed any preliminary discussions back to the section at our summer meeting. Does that game plan make sense to you?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Terry.
Okay, well, if there's no further business, the hearing section stands adjourned. Thank you, Melissa.
We'll start the lobster board at 2:30.